Can Counseling Be Unphilosophical is the title of this talk, and I will attempt a reductio ad absurdum from the perspective of philosophical health, and you will see what I mean, but I think philosophy has been often using Latin as a second language, and why not renew with that tradition? In the proliferating landscape of contemporary therapeutic practice, a curious phenomenon has emerged. Countless counselors operate under the assumption that their work can remain fundamentally unphilosophical. They believe themselves capable of facilitating healing, growth, and transformation while bracketing questions about the nature of human existence, the structure of reality, the relationship between purpose, values, actions, and the foundations of meaning-making. This assumption, I argue here, rests upon a fundamental absurdity that can be exposed through rigorous philosophical analysis, of which today, let's say, is the premise. So the present investigation employs a reductio ad absurdum, which is the logical demonstration, as you know, that a position leads inevitably to contradictory or absurd conclusions, to reveal the impossibility of truly unphilosophical counseling. Drawing from the comprehensive framework of philosophical health, of which some of you are familiar here, I demonstrate that any attempt to practice counseling without philosophical engagement necessarily collapses into performative self-contradiction across 5 fundamental dimensions of human existence. So this argument carries important implications, not merely for the specialized field of philosophical counseling, but for the entire therapeutic enterprise. If counseling cannot coherently claim to be unphilosophical, then all counseling is, in its essential nature, philosophical counseling, whether practitioners acknowledge this or not. So the question becomes not whether counseling should engage with philosophical questions, but whether practitioners will cultivate conscious competence in their inevitable philosophical commitments. The stakes of this inquiry extend beyond academic philosophy or therapeutic methodology. In an era characterized by widespread existential confusion, ethical disorientation, and what we might call planetary unhealth, therapeutic practices that deny their own philosophical foundations cannot adequately address the deep challenges facing contemporary existence. Only by embracing counseling's philosophical essence can practitioners offer genuine therapeutic authority in addressing the crisis of meaning and deep orientation that permeates modern life. So let's look at the first contradiction. This contradiction emerges when we examine how counselors engage with questions of embodiment, bodily sense, and physical experience. Consider the counselor who claims to work unphilosophically with clients experiencing bodily distress, trauma, somatic symptoms. This practitioner would insist they are simply applying evidence-based techniques without engaging in philosophical speculation about the nature of embodied existence. Yet, the moment this counselor begins their work, they encounter an unsurmountable contradiction. To address bodily experience therapeutically, they must necessarily operate with some conception of the relationship, for instance, between mind and body. Whether they explicitly acknowledge it or not, every intervention carries implicit assumptions about this fundamental philosophical question. If the counselor treats bodily symptoms as purely physical phenomena requiring only medical or behavioral intervention, they implicitly endorse a mechanistic dualism that separates mind from body. If they acknowledge that psychological states influence physical experience, they tacitly accept some form of psychomatic integration. If they recognize that bodily experience shapes emotional and cognitive states, they implicitly affirm embodied cognition theories. The absurdity deepens when we recognize that the counselor cannot avoid making normative judgments about what constitutes healthy embodiment. When they encourage a client to listen to their body or develop body awareness, they necessarily invoke philosophical assumptions about the nature of bodily wisdom, the relationship between sensation and knowledge, and the proper relationship between conscious intention and somatic experience. Furthermore, the very act of therapeutic dialogue requires the counselor to navigate the philosophical puzzle of intersubjectivity. How can one embodied consciousness meaningfully engage with another? How do we account for the apparent fact that speaking about bodily experience can alter bodily states? These questions demand philosophical engagement, not merely technical application. So the counselor who claims to bracket these philosophical questions while working with embodied experience finds themselves in the absurd position of simultaneously denying and affirming theories of embodiment. They cannot coherently maintain their unphilosophical stance because every therapeutic intervention reveals implicit commitments about the fundamental nature of embodied existence. The contradiction becomes even more pronounced when we examine counseling that addresses questions of identity, sense of self, authenticity, selfhood. Contemporary therapeutic practice regularly engages with clients struggling with identity confusion, role transition, authenticity concerns, and questions of personal continuity across the years. The counselor who claims to address these concerns without philosophical engagement faces an immediate performative contradiction. To work therapeutically with identity, the counselor must necessarily operate with some conception of what constitutes authentic selfhood. When they encourage clients to be true to themselves or discover their authentic identity, they invoke complex philosophical assumptions about the nature of personal identity, the relationship between social roles and genuine selfhood, and the possibility of self-knowledge. Consider the therapeutic intervention that encourages a client to question limiting self-beliefs or explore alternative self-conceptions. This intervention necessarily assumes that the self is not fixed, that personal identity involves some element of choice, construction maybe, and that authentic existence requires ongoing self-examination. These assumptions directly engage with philosophical questions that have occupied thinkers since Socrates all the way to Sartre. The absurdity becomes particularly acute when we recognize that the very notion of therapeutic change requires a philosophical account of personal continuity. How can we meaningfully speak of the same person changing or mentally healing over time? What persists through the transformation that counseling aims to facilitate? The counselor cannot avoid implicit commitments to some theory of personal identity, whether psychological continuity, narrative identity, or, for instance, embodied existence. Moreover, the moment the counselor makes normative judgments about healthy identity development, for instance, distinguishing between authentic self-expression and self-deception, mature identity integration and identity confusion, they necessarily engage with philosophical questions about human flourishing and the good life. The psychological idea of eudaimonic well-being etymologically presupposes a good spirit or daimon within us. The art of exploring and improving spirit is, by definition, the philosophical art itself. Our unphilosophical counselor, working with identity, thus occupies an absurd position. They facilitate identity exploration while denying engagement with the philosophical questions that make such exploration meaningful. They cannot coherently maintain their stance because every intervention reveals implicit metaphysical and normative commitments about the nature of selfhood and authentic existence. The contradiction extends to therapeutic work addressing belonging, relationships, community. Counselors regularly help clients navigate family dynamics, friendship challenges, romantic relationships, and questions of social belonging. Those who claim to do this work unphilosophically encounter immediate difficulties. To address belonging therapeutically, the counselor must necessarily operate with some conception of what constitutes a genuine human or beyond human connection. When they help clients establish or expand boundaries, they invoke implicit theories about the proper balance between autonomy and interdependence. When they facilitate conflict resolution, they necessarily draw upon assumptions about communication, mutual recognition, and the possibility or not of shared understanding. The counselor cannot address questions of belonging without engaging philosophical questions about human nature itself. Are humans fundamentally social beings whose well-being depends upon community, or autonomous individuals who enter relationships by choice or even obligation? How do we balance individual authenticity with social harmony? What constitutes just and caring relationships? Furthermore, contemporary therapeutic work increasingly recognizes the importance of cultural identity, social justice concerns, and systemic oppression in shaping individual well-being. The counselor who addresses these dimensions necessarily engages with philosophical questions about power, justice, recognition, and the relationship between individual suffering and social structure. The absurdity reaches its peak when we recognize that the therapeutic relationship itself requires philosophical navigation of intersubjective connection. The counselor must somehow account for how two separate consciousnesses can meaningfully encounter one another, how understanding and intellectual or emotional empathy are possible and what constitutes ethical engagement with another's vulnerability in this face-to-face dialogue. Our unphilosophical practitioner working with belonging thus faces the absurd task of facilitating relationships while denying engagement with the philosophical questions that make genuine relationships possible. They cannot maintain pertinence because every therapeutic intervention addressing belonging reveals implicit commitments about human nature, intersubjectivity, and the conditions for authentic connection. But perhaps nowhere is the contradiction more evident than in counseling that addresses clients' sense of possibility, agency, and potential for change. Therapeutic practice fundamentally aims to expand clients' perception of what is possible for them, helping them overcome limiting beliefs, develop new capacities, and envision alternative futures. The counselor who claims to do this work without philosophical engagement faces another immediate contradiction. To expand a client's sense of possibility, the counselor must necessarily operate with assumptions about human agency, freedom, and the nature of change itself, among others. When they challenge deterministic thinking patterns or encourage clients to take responsibility for their choices, they invoke complex philosophical commitments about free will, moral responsibility, and the relationship between past conditioning and present agency, if any. The therapeutic intervention that helps clients envision new possibilities often implicitly assumes that the future is not completely determined by the past, that conscious intention can influence outcomes, and that individuals possess some capacity for self-transformation. Otherwise, any counseling would be unuseful. These assumptions directly engage with fundamental philosophical questions about determinism, causation, human agency, that have occupied philosophers for millennia. Moreover, the counselor cannot address possibility without making normative judgments about what kinds of possibilities are worth pursuing. When they help clients distinguish between healthy growth or destructive patterns, sustainable change and temporary fixes, they necessarily invoke philosophical conceptions of human flourishing and the good life. The absurdity deepens when we recognize that therapeutic work with possibility necessarily engages with questions about the nature of hope, imagination, and creative potential. How do we account for the human capacity to envision alternatives to present circumstances, sometimes called counterfactual thinking? What makes some possibilities more meaningful or valuable than others? What does it mean for a reality that is not yet actualized to be possible rather than impossible? These questions demand philosophical engagement, not merely technical application or decision-making. Our poor unphilosophical counselor, working with possibility, thus occupies a dangerous position. They facilitate expansion of agency and potential while denying engagement with the philosophical questions that make agency and potential meaningful concepts. They cannot maintain coherence, once again, because every intervention addressing possibility reveals implicit commitments about human nature, causation, and the structure of meaningful change. I'm not done hammering on the head of the unphilosophical counselor, bear with me. A decisive contradiction emerges when counselors address questions of meaning, direction, and life purpose. Contemporary therapeutic practice regularly engages with clients emerging and experiencing existential confusion, lack of direction, or questions about what makes life really worth living. The counselor would claim to be able to address these questions and concerns without philosophical engagement encounters the ultimate performative contradiction. To work therapeutically with questions of purpose and meaning, the counselor must necessarily operate with some conception of what constitutes a meaningful life. When they help clients clarify their values, explore their sense of calling, or navigate existential crises, they invoke fundamental philosophical assumptions about the nature of meaning, the structure of value, and the relationship between individual purpose and larger communities of purpose. The therapeutic intervention that encourages clients to examine their life direction necessarily assumes that some directions may be more fulfilling than others, that meaning can be distinguished from meaninglessness, and that individuals have some capacity to align or at least interrogate their lives with their deepest values. These assumptions directly engage with philosophical questions that constitute the core of existential philosophy. Furthermore, the counselor cannot address purpose without engaging normative questions about human flourishing. What kinds of purposes are worth pursuing in the longer term? How do we distinguish between authentic meaning and social conditioning? What is the relationship between individual fulfillment and contribution to a universalizable orientation? These questions require philosophical engagement. The absurdity of unphilosophical counseling becomes complete when we recognize that the very practice of counseling implicitly affirms that life can become more meaningful through conscious examination and intentional choice. This affirmation constitutes a philosophical position about human nature, the possibility of incremental wisdom, and the relationship between understanding and flourishing. Our unphilosophical counselor, addressing questions of purpose, thus faces the ultimate contradiction. They facilitate meaning-making while denying engagement with the philosophical questions that make serious and shareable meaning possible. Every intervention addressing purpose reveals implicit commitments about value, meaning, and the nature of a life worth living. These 5 contradictions emerge in a final and decisive absurdity that exposes the damageable incoherence of any counseling that would claim to be unphilosophical. The counselor who claims that therapeutic practice can remain unphilosophical is necessarily making a philosophical argument about the nature of counseling, human existence, and the relationship between theory and practice. This claim implicitly endorses a particular epistemological position, perhaps pragmatism, positivism, reductionism, or therapeutic positivism, one that brackets metaphysical questions in favor of practical results. But this bracketing is itself a philosophical move that carries implicit commitments about the relationship between knowledge and practice, the nature of human problems, and the conditions for therapeutic effectiveness. Moreover, the insistence that counseling can proceed without philosophical engagement necessarily assumes a particular view of human condition, that people can be helped without addressing fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and value. This assumption constitutes a particular philosophical anthropology, whether it is acknowledged or not. And more often than not, it is not acknowledged. This absurdity reaches another peak when we recognize the societal implications of this contradiction. Counselors who deny their philosophical commitments while occupying positions of therapeutic authority perpetuate a form of institutional absurdity. They claim expertise in facilitating human flourishing while denying engagement with the questions that determine what flourishing and human development means. This institutional absurdity contributes to the broader crisis of contemporary existence, the widespread sense of meaninglessness, ethical confusion, and existential disorientation that brings clients to counseling in the first place. So let it be clear, therapeutic practices that deny their own philosophical foundation cannot adequately address problems that are themselves philosophical in nature. I know I have competition, but bear with me, we're getting to the conclusion. Beyond logical contradiction, unphilosophical counseling results in therapeutic practices that are fundamentally impoverished. Without explicit engagement with philosophical questions, counselors cannot address the deep structures of meaning-making that shape human experience. The counselor who avoids questions of purpose and meaning will find it difficult to help clients address the long-term existential and spiritual dimensions of their difficulties. They remain trapped in symptomatic treatment that fails to engage the fundamental questions that give symptoms their larger significance. Superficial fixes might be possible, and they are often provided without the help of philosophizing, but not individual and collective philosophical health. The framework of philosophical health provides a comprehensive alternative that tries to acknowledge counseling's inherently philosophical nature by systematically and thoroughly attending to the phenomenological and existential dimensions of, for instance, bodily sense, sense of the self, sense of belonging, sense of the possible, sense of purpose, and philosophical sense. Counselors can engage with the philosophical presuppositions that emerge in any genuine therapeutic encounter. This does not mean ignoring the personal biography and individual narrative of the client or interviewee. The philosophical healthy approach does not impose abstract philosophical theories upon therapeutic practice, but rather acknowledges and cultivates the philosophical dimensions already present in all meaningful conversations about the good life. It recognizes that theoretical questions about embodiment, identity, belonging, possibility, purpose, and worldview are not optional additions to therapeutic work, but constitutive features of any practice that aims to facilitate genuine human flourishing. The philosophical health framework thus reveals that the choice is not between philosophical and unphilosophical counseling, but between explicit or implicit philosophical engagement. All counseling is philosophical counseling. The only question is whether practitioners will acknowledge and develop conscience and competence in their inevitable philosophical commitments, or remain like Mr. Jourdain in Molière, who utters sentences without knowing that this is prose, let alone poetry. Recognizing counseling's inherently philosophical nature carries implications for therapeutic practice and practitioners' training. Rather than attempting the impossible task of bracketing philosophical questions, counselors should develop philosophical literacy and competence. Training programs in mental health and well-being must integrate philosophical engagement not as an optional specialization, but as a necessary foundation, or at least a strong complement for competent practice. This integration might involve coursework in philosophical anthropology, ethics, existentialism, phenomenology, for instance. But more importantly, it requires cultivating comfort with philosophical questioning as an essential therapeutic skill. This can be attained by simply reading the classics, for instance. Hegel, Plato, Descartes, Nietzsche, Bergson. Here, please insert your favorite philosopher. Practitioners are also welcome to develop philosophical humility, a recognition that the questions addressed in counseling often exceed definitive solutions and require ongoing exploration. This humility paradoxically enhances rather than diminishes therapeutic authority by grounding practice in honest acknowledgement of the complexities involved in facilitating human flourishing. I'm about to conclude soon. This is related, for example, to deep listening. Thank you. Deep listening and attention to the singularity of each biography. By engaging explicitly and bother personally and philosophically with questions of embodiment, identity, belonging, purpose, counselors can offer clients the kind of comprehensive engagement that meaningful life challenges require. Such practice does not need to abandon technical competence. Say, for instance, a breathing or mindfulness technique for relaxation, but it integrates this within a broader philosophical framework that acknowledges the full complexity and value-laden nature of human existence. It recognizes that lasting therapeutic transformation often requires not merely symptom relief, but fundamental shifts in how clients understand themselves and their place in the world. To conclude, in an era characterized by increasing specialization, technical sophistication, AI, we must not lose sight of counseling's essential nature as philosophical engagement with the fundamental questions of human existence. The dimensions of contemporary existence cannot be adequately addressed through techniques that deny their own philosophical implications. Only by embracing humanity's philosophical condition, the fact that language and behavior require and reflect conceptual reflection and theoretical presuppositions, can practitioners offer the kind of comprehensive engagement that contemporary challenges require to sustain a eudynamic relationship between at least 4 cognitive dimensions: personal embodied cognition, earthly extended cognition, the inactive cognition of work, and our embedded societal cognition. The therapeutic necessity is a cultural and civilizational necessity if we are to address adequately the deep challenges facing human existence in our time. We must acknowledge that counseling in its essential nature is and has always been philosophical counseling. In the same manner that real dialogue about our place and action in the world always contains a philosophical dimension. The question is not whether counseling can be unphilosophical. It cannot and should not be. but whether practitioners will cultivate conscious competence in their inevitable philosophical commitments. This recognition opens the possibility for therapeutic practices that can engage meaningfully with the full complexity of human existence. Offering clients counseling is not merely symptom relief, but genuine engagement with the fundamental questions that give life its meaning and direction. In acknowledging counseling's philosophical essence, we reclaim its potential for facilitating the kind of comprehensive growth that our troubled world so desperately needs. A good and meaningful relationship with the possible and the compossible.